In 2005, General Motors sold this car to hundreds of thousands of Americans. It was affordable. It was marketed to young drivers, college students, and new families. They advertised it as reliable. They advertised it as safe. But buried deep inside the steering column of every single one of these cars was a component that cost exactly 57 cents. A tiny metal spring inside the ignition switch. It was so weak, so poorly designed, that just the weight of a heavy keychain, or a slight bump in the road, could turn the engine completely off while you were driving 70 miles an hour. When the engine cuts, you don't just lose power. The electronic power steering dies. The power brakes die. You are suddenly wrestling a 2-ton block of dead metal. And the most terrifying part? The airbags lose their power source. They don't deploy. You hit the tree, or the guardrail, or the oncoming car at highway speed with absolutely nothing but a seatbelt between you and the dashboard. General Motors knew. For 13 years, they knew. And they made a decision, a calculated, documented, corporate decision, that fixing a 57-cent part simply wasn't worth the cost. 124 people paid for that decision with their lives. To understand how a corporation worth over $100 billion decided that 124 deaths were an acceptable business expense, you have to look closely at one microscopic piece of engineering. The ignition switch in your car has 4 specific positions: off, accessory, run, start. A small, spring-loaded plunger called the detent clicks into place at each position, holding the key steady. That clicking resistance, that reassuring mechanical feedback when you turn your key, is called torque. It is the only thing preventing gravity and vibration from turning your car off while you drive. In 2001, a GM engineer named Ray DiGiorgio was handed a problem. The prototype ignition switch for the new Saturn Ion, a car built on the same platform as the Cobalt, failed internal torque testing. The detent spring was simply too short and too weak. It didn't hold the key firmly enough in the run position. During testing, engineers found that if they barely bumped the key, the car would shut off. DiGiorgio ran the tests. He saw the numbers fail. He knew the component did not meet General Motors' own safety specifications. And then, he did something that would define the next 13 years of automotive history. He approved the part anyway. In an email to the parts supplier, Delphi, he directed them to maintain present course. He famously referred to the component as the switch from hell. And then he signed his name on the final approval for mass production. Within a few years, millions of cars rolled off the assembly line carrying a switch that the very engineer who designed it knew was defective. The first documented fatality was a 16-year-old girl in Maryland. She was driving a 2003 Saturn Ion on a 2-lane road when the ignition switched off mid-drive. The car veered off the road and struck a tree. The airbags never deployed. She died on impact. GM dispatched investigators to examine the wreckage. Their internal report classified the incident not as a mechanical failure, but as driver error. Over the next several years, this horrifying pattern repeated itself across the country. Young drivers. Low-speed accidents that, by all metrics of modern automotive safety, should have been survivable. Airbags that mysteriously never deployed. And every single time, GM investigators reached the exact same conclusion: driver error. They blamed the victims. But one family refused to accept that answer. And they would ultimately force the truth into the light. On March 10, 2010, Brooke Melton was driving her 2005 Chevrolet Cobalt through a heavy rainstorm near Atlanta, Georgia. She was 29 years old. A dedicated pediatric nurse. She had called her parents just hours earlier to tell them her car had been acting strange, stalling intermittently, the dashboard lights flickering on and off without warning. At approximately 7:30 p.m., the ignition switch in her Cobalt slipped from the run position to accessory. The engine instantly died. The power steering locked up. The power brakes failed. Brooke's Cobalt drifted across the center line, directly into the path of oncoming traffic. The collision was catastrophic. The airbags never fired. She was killed on impact. GM's investigation concluded, once again, that the crash was simply the result of driving too fast for the weather conditions. Another tragic case of driver error. But Brooke Melton's parents knew their daughter was a careful driver. They didn't believe the report. They hired an attorney named Lance Cooper, a Georgia product liability lawyer who had absolutely no idea that the routine traffic accident case sitting on his desk was about to blow the lid off the largest automotive cover-up in American history. Cooper refused to settle. He hired an independent mechanical engineer to physically tear apart Brooke's wrecked Cobalt. What that engineer found hidden deep inside the steering column changed everything. The ignition switch from Brooke's wrecked 2005 car was carefully dismantled and placed side by side with an ignition switch purchased from a dealership for a brand new 2008 Cobalt. On paper, these two switches should have been physically identical. They shared the exact same part number. They shared the same specifications. They weren't identical. The new switch had a visibly longer, substantially stronger detent spring. The internal mechanism had been completely overhauled. Someone at General Motors had quietly redesigned the ignition switch in 2006, specifically to increase the torque and fix the fatal flaw. And then they did something almost unthinkable in the world of automotive engineering. They didn't change the part number. In manufacturing, every physical change to a component gets a new part number. It is a fundamental law of engineering. It's how mechanics, regulators, and crash investigators track modifications across millions of vehicles. Changing a critical safety component without updating its part number is the functional equivalent of altering evidence. It makes the old, defective, deadly version completely invisible to the outside world. And that is precisely what happened. Court documents obtained through Cooper's relentless discovery process revealed a shocking truth. Ray DiGiorgio, the exact same engineer who had approved the defective switch back in 2002, had personally signed the engineering authorization for the redesign in 2006. He knew the original part was flawed. He authorized the fix. And he deliberately left the part number unchanged. The cover-up began to unravel in a deposition room. When DiGiorgio was questioned under oath by Lance Cooper in the Melton family lawsuit, he was asked directly whether he had ever authorized any changes to the ignition switch design. He looked the attorney in the eye, and he said no. He claimed he had no knowledge of any redesign. Cooper then slid a piece of paper across the table. It was the 2006 authorization document. DiGiorgio's own signature was at the bottom. He had signed it himself. 4 years earlier. But the cover-up wasn't just the work of one rogue engineer. Internal GM documents revealed a systemic, institutional culture that actively suppressed the defect to protect the bottom line. Investigators discovered that in 2005, a GM committee reviewed the ignition switch problem. They had reports of cars stalling. They knew it was a safety issue. But they concluded, in writing, that the tooling cost and piece price are too high to justify a design change. The estimated cost of fixing the defective spring across all affected vehicles? 57 cents per car. Less than $1. Less than the cost of a cup of gas station coffee. The internal cost-benefit analysis weighed the price of a massive recall against the projected liability from wrongful death lawsuits. The math was horrifyingly simple. If fewer than a certain number of people die, paying out the lawsuits costs less than recalling millions of cars. As long as the death toll stayed small enough, silence was the cheaper option. Furthermore, GM trained its employees in a bizarre corporate language designed to evade legal liability. In internal presentations, engineers were explicitly instructed never to use words like defect, stall, dangerous, or fatal. Instead, they were told to use sanitized terms like issue, condition, or customer convenience. For 13 years, the number of deaths stayed small enough. The sanitized language worked. Until the truth became too massive to hide. In February 2014, the dam finally broke. General Motors issued its first recall. 800,000 Chevrolet Cobalts and Pontiac G5s. But as the investigation widened, the true scale of the disaster became undeniable. Within months, the recall expanded. And expanded. And expanded. By the end of 2014, General Motors had recalled nearly 30 million vehicles worldwide. 30 million cars carrying a part that an engineer had called the switch from hell 12 years earlier. Newly appointed CEO Mary Barra was called to testify before a furious Congress. She apologized. She promised sweeping changes. She called GM's historic failures unacceptable. But the grieving family sitting behind her in that hearing room weren't there for corporate apologies. They were there for accountability. In 2015, the Department of Justice charged General Motors with wire fraud for deliberately concealing a deadly defect from regulators and the American public. The penalty was a deferred prosecution agreement and a staggering fine of $900 million. To handle the fallout, the company established an independent compensation fund. After rigorously reviewing thousands of claims, the fund officially attributed 124 deaths and 274 severe injuries directly to the defective ignition switch. 124 people. 57 cents. General Motors ultimately paid over $2.5 billion in total, including fines, victim settlements, recall execution costs, and legal fees, to resolve a defect that would have cost them less than 1 single cent per dollar of a car's sticker price. Ray DeGiorgio was fired, along with 14 other GM executives and engineers. An exhaustive 315-page internal investigation called the Volucas Report documented a deeply entrenched culture of what it called incompetence and neglect. It described a corporation where the infamous GM nod was common practice, a culture where everyone in the room would nod in agreement that a problem existed, and then no one would do absolutely anything to fix it. Today, General Motors operates under a completely restructured safety review process. Every internal complaint is meticulously tracked. Every defect gets a rigid timeline. The company has publicly committed to never again allowing cost analysis to override human safety. But the part that started it all, that pathetic 57-cent spring, sits in engineering textbooks now. Not as a lesson in manufacturing defects, but as a haunting case study in how corporate systems designed to protect people can be quietly, devastatingly engineered to protect profit instead. The ignition switch that killed 124 people wasn't a failure of engineering. It was a failure of choice. An engineer who knew the truth. Executives who calculated the odds. And a corporation that decided, for 13 years, that 57 cents was just too expensive. That's the fatal flaw. Not in the machine. In the math. Subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.